Hello. I am here to talk about a very specific kind of book because right now I'm talking about books that I am reading for my video game history project. Now, where I'm starting out with this is with more general histories of video games. And since I'm reading these books, I figured that I might share my thoughts about individual books as we go along in case you wanted to read these things and you wanted to know which books were going to really answer the kinds of questions you're interested in. Because history books can't cover everything, they make choices. And so it's a matter of figuring out which books are going to align best with your interests. Now, my interest is to get a very complete understanding, so I'm going to read very many of them. Hopefully, I can shortcut the process for you when you're exploring video game history yourself. So, this is The Ultimate History of Video Games, Volume 1 by Stephen Kent. Now, it didn't used to be Volume 1. It used to just be The Ultimate History of Video Games when it released, I believe, initially in 2001. Obviously, a lot has happened since then, and since that point, he has released a Volume 2. But Volume 1, in I should also mention, I believe there are two forms of Volume 1. There's the original form of Volume 1, which ends, I believe, a little bit earlier than the new version. I believe the original version doesn't include the PlayStation 2 and the Xbox. And I'm not sure if it included the Nintendo 64. Not sure. But the version I read did. So, what is the point of this book specifically? So, this book, I'm going to say, really focuses on hardware. Once we get past things like Space War, you're not going to see much of the PC gaming space at all. You will still see a lot of the arcade space up until, at least until the end of the VCS or the Atari 2600 era. You will still see a lot of the arcade games being talked about, and I think very convincingly tied into the history of the console space. I think the book very convincingly ties in pinball into the history of the arcade space, although it goes maybe a little lighter on the electromechanical machines than I think it could. I think it could have benefited from just a little bit more of that, not too much more. And the other thing is that it's very hyper focused on the United States and Japan, because we are the two countries that produced consoles for the most part. I believe you get a little bit of interaction with Britain in there, but you're not going to see, the weird French art games that were coming out, or the bit of Spanish PC gaming from the late 80s, early 90s. You're not going to see that in this book. It is, I think, for the first, 7/8, written very well. Very well, very thorough. It is also a very good narrative. It manages to balance a lot of threads in a very convincing manner for the first 7/8 of it. Once we get past the release of the PlayStation 1, it starts to come apart a little bit. That is a very complicated time. I don't know that I've read anything yet that doesn't come apart a little bit there. So I can't hold it too hard against it, but it would have perhaps benefited from just a little more structure at that end. In terms of the narrative, though, it really makes a complicated set of stories not only very understandable, but very interconnected. You can understand the connection of not only Space War to Atari, see the line that goes like through Atari from Nolan Bushnell making Space War. Well, he didn't make Space War. He made a the first video game console, coin-op console of Space War. That was put out into the field, right, and was sold multiple units. You can see the direct thread from that through Atari's history up until the video game crash, pretty clearly. But you can also they do a very good job at showing Nintendo starting to poke its nose in with some some arcade games, and that you start seeing it. You start understanding the distribution challenges that it had, the challenges of setting up Nintendo America. It starts building that story very well. It does a fantastic job of showing the work it had to do to get the video game console market back alive in the United States. It did a great job really going into the Sega Nintendo war in the 90s, late 80s, early 90s. It did a fantastic job with all of that. It really made the personalities stick out, give you a sense of things. It didn't get too far down, I think, into having to describe every individual person, but it did do a very good job at making sure you understood here are the people that the book is identifying as the key players. Here are their personalities built up over multiple stories, and so on. Now, things that I think it's a little weak at. So, arcade gaming and the home consoles, were absolutely two of the most important legs. Probably the two, not probably, they were the two most profitable legs at their time of the video game industry. But that's not, I think, a valid reason to ignore the PC market, because the PC market was engaging in a lot of innovations that were not, I think, thoroughly examined by this book. For example, you can talk about adventure, which a lot of people know as 1980 Adventure on the Atari VCS, the Atari 2600. It was a very important game. It's where we get the term adventure games. But that's not the original version of adventure. The original version of adventure came out years beforehand as Colossal Cave Adventure, and a lot of the innovations in software had happened in the PC space. First on the mainframe connected to ARPANET with people sharing things around, and then on home computers, people made various versions of it and sold it widely. And then after all of that time, that's when adventure comes to the VCS. And I don't know that you can really talk about some of that without the connection. Now, another point is that perhaps at this time, you see less bleed over. Whenever this book was written, you see less bleed over from the PC space to the console space. So something that is a seminal moment in video games, like the run of success that id Software had in the early 90s with Wolfenstein 3D, then Doom, and then Doom 2, basically inventing FPS, not whole cloth. They took inspiration from other things, but they defined the modern genre. Well, when in 2001, when this book was written, you didn't really have first-person shooters on consoles. first-person shooters on a console was a very hard thing that wasn't really solved until GoldenEye, perhaps. And so, if you're telling the story of a console, that might not seem so important to talk about first-person shooters in a world before Halo and Call of Duty. So maybe we can give Kent some slack on that. I am interested in seeing how he follows that up in Volume 2, because as you go through the history of video games, the lines become very blurred between PC and console. To the point where we are today, where arguably there is only a difference in hardware and the difference in software is disappearing every day. So we'll see how that goes. But in this first book, I found it lacking. I found it lacking partly because I had enough background knowledge to know what was missing from the story. And every historian needs to make choices in order to render their arguments. And I think Kent does a very good job for the most part. It's very readable. It's very enjoyable. It just perhaps suffers a little bit. I think that it does a pretty good job of covering both the software and the hardware, and it does a pretty good job covering the artistry and the business side and the engineering side. It doesn't go into amazing depth on any of these in the pursuit of catching most of these. And again, its primary mission appears to be constructing an intelligible narrative of relatively few threads to give you the general idea of the thrust of the video game market, which in doing so becomes a focus on the consoles and the console companies themselves that are driving things. So, overall, a very good book. A very good book. I think that if you read it and if you're interested in the history of the consoles, it'll do you a great job. I think if you're interested in a more holistic understanding of the first, say 30 years from 70 to 2000, right, of the video game business, I think that you'll want to supplement, perhaps with one of the other books I'll talk about in a future video. But definitely not a waste of your time. Definitely you'll learn valuable things here. So that's my thoughts on that. I believe the next book I'll talk about is Replay, which I finished recently. It's like Replay, the History of Video Games, something along those lines. It's another good book with its own flaws and strengths. But we'll talk about that later. And I'm feeling like I want to get some kind of gameplay up on here soon. So I am thinking about that too. Like, if you want to hear more about these books as I'm going along, comment if you have any questions or any bits you want to discuss more in depth, and subscribe if you want to see what kind of nonsense I get up to on this channel. That's all I have for now. Bye-bye.